My name is Jeffrey Goodman, pastor at Salem Evangelical Lutheran Church here in Ephrata, Pennsylvania. I'd like to talk with you a little bit about the vestments pastors wear in the church. I'm coming to you presently wearing a cassock, and the cassock is the everyday dress of pastors, or at least it was a long time ago. This is what pastors would wear day to day underneath other vestments that I'll get into in just a bit. Maybe we should talk a little bit about the question of why do pastors wear vestments? Well, one of the reasons why pastors wear vestments is because it covers up their identity. It is the uniform of an office, the office of pastor, of the office of ministry and word and sacrament. And so, since the earliest days of the church, pastors, preachers have worn vestments. And of course, we can also see glimpses of vestments being worn in the Old Testament. And so we know that the ministry of the New Testament is not a carryover of the Old Testament ministry, but rather is an entirely new thing that's rooted in the gospel. And so whether a pastor wears vestments or doesn't wear vestments, this is a matter of adiaphora. That is, they are free either to wear vestments or not to wear vestments. But one of the reasons why pastors do wear vestments, as I mentioned, it is a sign of the office. And so let's start at the very basic level. Here is the cassock, the everyday dress of pastors. This really changed, particularly in the European context after Vatican II in the early 1960s. In the Roman Catholic Church, this was the everyday dress of priests and bishops. But after Vatican II, there was more of an emphasis towards wearing street clothing and a collar with a sport jacket or a suit of some sort. In the Lutheran Church, especially here in America, the cassock was always seen as a vestment that is to be used with other vestments. It would have been a pretty rare thing to see a Lutheran pastor walking down the street wearing a cassock going to lunch and so forth. Of course, it does happen, and I actually know a pastor who would do that, but that's a pretty rare thing. And so this is the cassock. It is black, and it has a notch for the collar. In the Anglican tradition, they would have buttons that go down the center, or as in this one, has the buttons fastened at the top here. In the Anglican tradition, it signifies perhaps your churchmanship and things like that. But in the Lutheran Church, we don't really have those kinds of issues, but rather this is just a plain old cassock that is worn under undergarments. The next vestment I'd like to talk about is the surplice. The surplice goes over the cassock. And we see this primarily worn in the Lutheran Church for the daily offices. So that is morning prayer and evening prayer. And so generally it's either worn with a stole or without a stole. If the service did not have communion, the pastor would generally wear a cassock and surplice such as this. The surplice can be long, it can go all the way down to the ankles, or as in the case of this one, cut off around mid-calf. As I mentioned, this is the vestment that's primarily worn for the daily offices of morning prayer and evening prayer. It would also be worn for individual confession and absolution, and would also potentially could be worn for funerals and any other service of the word. Without Holy Communion. One of the things that the white certainly signifies is baptism. That the wearer of this vestment is a baptized servant of Christ. And the cassock and surplice is not limited to pastors. The cassock and surplice certainly can be seen in some churches being worn by servers, those who serve at the altar as communion assistants, chalice bearers, or lectors. I've seen it worn in choirs. And so it's a general purpose vestment that can be worn by pastors and laity, by deacons, and it is used primarily in the Lutheran Church for the daily offices and for service of the word. The next vestment I'd like to talk with you about is the thaler and befken. This vestment finds its historic usage in the university. So following the Reformation, in the freedom of the gospel, pastors who saw their education requirements greatly and dramatically increased from the pre-Reformation days, began to wear their academic vestments in the pulpits of the churches. And so by the 18th century, this became the common dress for Lutheran pastors throughout Germany and Denmark. Probably the one that we're most familiar with is Henry Muhlenberg, the patriarch of the Lutheran Church here in Pennsylvania and on the East Coast. Henry Muhlenberg, on his way to organize the Lutheran Church here in Pennsylvania, stopped in London. And there in London, he had a thaler and befken made in the Anglican style. And so when he came to Pennsylvania, it was precisely this type of vestment that he wore in organizing the Lutheran Church and preaching and teaching throughout the eastern seaboard of the United States and throughout the British colonies. This vestment became the standard vestment found throughout North America all the way through the 19th century and probably into the early 20th century as well. The alb has its roots in the historic dress of the Roman Empire, and we can also see in its color white a connection to baptism, the baptismal identity of the person wearing it. The alb can be worn by pastors, it can be worn by deacons, it can be worn by those assisting at the altar, such as a chalice bearer, a communion assistant, a lector, and so the alb then, again, is primarily there to cover the identity of the person wearing it. The person wearing it is in an office. Whether it is a lector or a pastor or deacon, they are bearing an office in the church. And so this is the first vestment that one sees primarily in the church throughout the world. One would see this in Roman churches, Lutheran churches, Anglican churches. It is the common vestment and became ever more so in the Lutheran Church after Vatican II in the 1960s. And so in most Lutheran churches, you will see the pastor presiding in and out. The next vestment that one commonly sees with the alb and also with the cassock and surplice is the stole. The stole is another mark of the office of a pastor. And so pastors generally will be wearing a stole that comes down on both sides. You may identify a deacon by a stole that goes across, like this, across the chest, and then comes down to one side. The stole is, as I mentioned, the primary marker of the pastor in the church. It may be worn, again, with the alb, the cassock and surplice, and one has even seen it worn with academic vestments and the thaler and befken, although that's much rarer and much less common. And so that is the stole. After the pastor dons the alb and the stole, the cincture is next. The cincture is a rope-like belt that is fastened on the left side, usually with some sort of knot. And of course, one is bound to Christ as a servant of the word. And so the cincture holds things together. And of course, one is free to wear a cincture or not. And then we'll look at the next piece of the next historic vestment that goes over the alb, the stole, and the cincture is the chasuble. The chasuble. And of course, the chasuble finds its roots as well in the everyday dress of the Roman citizen or someone, a subject of the Roman Empire. The church adopted it then. And one of the things that I've heard about the chasuble is that it signifies the fullness of the Holy Communion. The chasuble then, along with the stole, changes colors with the season. And presently we're in the Sundays after Epiphany. It's green. And so the stole would be green. The chasuble is green. As we move into Easter, it would be white, purple for Lent, and royal blue or purple for Advent, and red for Pentecost and Martyrs' Days and commemorations and the like. And so the chasuble then is worn at the Holy Communion, a service of word and sacrament. It would not be worn outside of the Holy Communion. This is the vestment for the divine service, for the Mass, for the service of Eucharist, as we have those terms for our worship services. Thank you for joining me as we looked at some of the vestments that we have here at Salem Evangelical Lutheran Church and some of the reasons why and the different vestments that pastors wear, and as well as those who serve at the altar and in other offices in the church. So thanks for joining me. God bless you and keep you. Goodbye.